All right, so we're going to try to do the impossible today and get through an entire chapter of John in one sitting. And I know generally the pace we've been going, it seems like, well, that's not going to happen, but this narrative almost kind of demands it. But I don't want to lose sight of the larger narrative. So John chapter 7, John introduces us to this Feast of Tabernacles portion of Scripture. So if you look at John chapter 7, and then maybe write in, if you do that kind of thing in your Bible, write in John 10:21, because really that's where this particular narrative it ends, right? So from John 7 all the way to John chapter 10, verse 21, it's all one story. And this is, John's such an amazing writer, the way he kind of writes all this the connective tissue in all these things it's so strong. And then when you get to John 10:21, it's really the end of all this that started in 7, where in John 10:21 it says, these are not the words of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? And then you transition into the Feast of Dedication or Hanukkah, and now we're on to a different narrative. So really you have 3.5 chapters or so of this Feast of Tabernacles, and then all the way to what we're reading today, which is kind of the climax of the story that starts in John 7, and then what we'll cover next week, John 10 to 10:21, is kind of like the epilogue. It's the ending of the story as he kind of closes that narrative. So a lot's happened. John 7, Feast of Tabernacles, he doesn't go up. He's got that disbelief from his own brothers, and you see all these things happen. He comes up in the middle of the feast. He starts teaching. There's already a lot of, in the group it says here, they already want to kill him. They already have desires to put him in prison. All of his preaching is drawing consternation, but some people are following. How does this man know these things? Have he never studied? And then all this is kind of climaxed in a way in what we're going to read today, but then chapter 8 kind of segues into that pericope adultery that we looked at, and how there's a little bit of, does this belong in the canon or not? But it seems to kind of fit in there. And then that transitions into his statements, I'm the light of the world. And we covered all these things the last 2 weeks about truth, right? Freedom in truth, and then how they kind of wrangled with the truth, the things that he's saying, the hard things, which ultimately there led to him saying, before Abraham was, I am, right? Before Abraham was, which means that he had a starting point, he had a finish point. I never had a starting point. I've always been. So that was what led to them trying to stone him. And then he passes out of the temple this whole time he's been teaching there. And then we get to John chapter 9. And we're going to read all this in one sitting, and then hopefully kind of helps us kind of encapsulate what's going on today. And then we'll start covering, kind of expositing through that. But let's start in verse 1, John chapter 9. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he, and others said, he is like him. And he said, I am he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, where is he? And he said, I do not know. They brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him, because he opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him, that he had been blind and received his sight. until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered and said, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." Then they said to him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from." The man answered and said to them, "Why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of the blind, of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered and said to him, "You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they cast him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" He answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." Then he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, "Are we blind also?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, 'We see,' therefore your sin remains." There's, as one pastor put it, there's some texts that kind of preach themselves. And I feel like when you read through this is kind of one of those passages, because when you read it all in just one chapter, the message is very clear. But we'll still look at some insights here. Noteworthy insights and new eyes. So I tried to make it easy to remember. When you're looking at John chapter 9, made a little acronym for you, right? Noteworthy insights, new eyes. And there just so happens that I made 9 insights. Now there are definitely more, but there's definitely not less, okay? So 9 insights for today. And it's a really interesting story, one that's really quite amazing. And again, the climax of this whole narrative, starting in John chapter 7, a man getting healed from being born blind. And we don't know how old he is, but the first thing that we can see that we'll just pull out of here, the first insight, is that Jesus was not deterred from his appointed task. So you look at the last verse of John chapter 8. Pull this up here. Last verse of John chapter 8, they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. So just think about the mindset there. Put yourself in those shoes. You're in a crowded public place. You leave because your life is under threat. They want to kill you. They want to take up stones to murder you. I highly doubt that any of our thoughts would be, I'm going to go out and help somebody right now, right? He passes by out of the temple, and then as he passes by, he happens to see, the text says, he notices the blind man. The blind man's certainly not going to notice him. He's not crying out like Bartimaeus. He doesn't know who Jesus is yet. So Jesus notices this fellow. And again, think about that mindset, that compassionate mindset. He's not deterred from that task. And we're going to find out later that this man, it's hard truth to wrap our minds around, was born blind from birth so that the glories of God might be revealed. It's tough to grasp. It's tough to wrestle with. But that's just what the text says. But think about that. And this is what we see over and over in Jesus' life from a young child, even into his adulthood. Look at this incident in Luke 2, which you know. It says, so it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers. So there he is in the midst of them again. This time he's a young boy, though, listening to them and asking questions, and all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And then 20 or so years later, they're not so much astonished as they are enraged, and they want to kill this same person. But when they saw him, his parents, they're amazed, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously." That's kind of what I think, where we would be emotionally, where our mind would be, is we would be very anxious, we'd be very fearful, fleeing the scene in terms of what happened in John 9. But here Jesus is and saying, "Hey, I don't know why you're so anxious. Why did you seek me?" In verse 49, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" I must be about my Father's business. We've already seen in John a couple times in chapter 4, Jesus says to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." Then in John 5, "I have a greater witness than John's for the works which the Father has given me to finish." So these are miracles that he's been doing, works that he's been doing and will do. "The very works that I do bear witness of me, that my Father sent me." So even in the midst of all this kind of what we would think is a chaotic situation, imagine if you're just viewing that, and even his disciples, right? It doesn't tell us what the disciples were thinking, but the disciples clearly take notice that Jesus notices this blind man, which leads to them asking the question, which is kind of maybe Jesus makes mention of it and the disciples then respond. But is our mindset the same as Jesus' mindset? And again, it's hard to have that same mindset because his is a divine mission, right? And he's a divine figure, and he's perfect in everything he does, and he's going to finish that task. He's about his Father's business. He must do the work. It's his food. That's his sustenance, in other words, he kind of alludes to in John 4. Sometimes it's hard because, again, we get so distracted with life. And would that be our mindset if an attempt is made on our life as we're fleeing the scene, as we're leaving through the midst of them, to notice somebody who needs help, who's going to ultimately be a vessel of mercy? Do we take notice of things like that, or are we preoccupied with the stuff going on in our day-to-day? But that leads to the second issue here in insight number 2, that it's easy to assume knowledge of God's plan, but it's difficult to actually understand those plans. And I say that because what's the disciples' questions here, right? Who sinned? Because we're already assuming somebody sinned, so they're assuming they know why this man is in the predicament that he's in. Who sinned, this man or his parents? It was an either-or question. And Jesus' answer is neither. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. So they are assuming that they know why this man is in the state that he's in, and Jesus gives them an answer which they probably weren't expecting, but that's hard to understand. We're not told how old this person is, but the fact that his parents say he's of age indicates that he's probably older than 20 based on kind of some historical things that you can read. He was old enough for service. He was old enough to be considered a man or of age. So he should be able to speak for himself. But he's born blind from birth, and we'll talk about his parents later and why he's on the street and why his parents are the way that they are. But he didn't have an easy life. Begging is, being blind, they said, was one of the worst things you could be at that day, because your whole life, your whole sustenance depends on the mercy of others. Is somebody going to stop like Jesus did or feel pity? And he was parked in a good spot, right? Right, probably nearby where the temple's at, right over there. That's a great spot to be, because as people leave, a great spot to camp out would be probably outside of a Catholic church. People leaving the parking lots there, people feeling really bad, things like that. But that's hard to understand, to think that somebody was going to be born blind just for this sake. But wait till the end of the story, because I think that ultimately the blind man would say it was worth it. And that's kind of something that we need to keep in mind. But we see this discussion, this idea of God's retribution law, where God does things to you, or so they assumed, because of some sin that you committed. Maybe even in the womb, some of the old rabbis would say, like, God knew you were going to sin, so now you're afflicted with this ailment. And we see this in Job, right? His friend Eliphaz, "Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." So Job's declaring his innocence, but then his friends are saying, well, Job, you probably have some secret sin, right? Come on, fess up. And they're pressing him and pressing him and pressing him on this. And then you have Bildad, if your sons maybe have sinned against him, he has cast them away for their transgression. Not the kind of comfort that you want to see when all of your children die, and now you have your friend Bildad saying they probably had some secret sin, which is why all of your children are now dead. That's why he calls them miserable comforters, right? I mean, this is not the kind of comfort. If you went to school today to maybe be some kind of a therapist or something like that, this would not be a good one. This is not good advice here. Then you have Zophar in chapter 11. If iniquity were in your hand and you put it far away, and would not let wickedness dwell in your tents. So now he's probably saying it's one of you. It's you and your wife, or it's your kids, and somebody in your family, in your tents, have sinned. Then surely you could lift up your face without spot. Yes, you could be steadfast and not fear. But what they fail to understand is that we are given the punchline in the first verse of Job, where it says he's blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. We talked about this when we did our Job series. But the idea is people have this idea that if you've done something wrong, or if you have some affliction, vice versa, God's going to punish you, or he will preemptively punish you for that. What Jesus is saying here, it wasn't him or it wasn't his parents, but that the works of God might be shown in him. The ultimate answer, of course, is that it was due to sin, just not his parents' sin or his sin. Romans 5:12, therefore just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sin. So ultimately this whole episode's playing out because of what happened in the garden. Later on, a few verses later in Romans 5, Paul's going to say, if by one man's offense death reigned through one, then in verse 18, through one man's offense judgment comes to all. If one man's disobedience, many were made sinners. So you have death coming, judgment coming, all these bad things coming because of one man, ultimately, right? But in those verses, Paul writes the flip side, right? If by one man came death, and it came through one, how much more who those receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. If judgment came to all from one man, resulting in condemnation, even so through one man's righteous act, the free gift came to all men, resulting in justification of life. Through disobedience, many were made sinners. Also through by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. So it's difficult to understand how these things could be. And you talk about the idea of theodicy and why there's evil in the world, and it's always the first place that unbelievers generally will run to. Well, why did this thing happen? And it's hard to get them to put on the glasses of saying, okay, well, you have to understand these ideas of sin and take them to kind of elementary things that we know, but they don't want to believe that. They're not willing, like it says in John 5:40, that they should believe, because they're wrestling with this truth that says, okay, God's laid it out there, there's sin, but I also have a solution for that. So their problem is the sin that they see all around us, but they don't want the solution that's offered. That's where we see the problem there, and that's what we're going to see from the Pharisees. Excuse me. Insight number 3, Jesus had a limited time to accomplish his work, and then I added on there, we have a limited time as well. So when Jesus says in verse 4, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work, and as long as I am the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus is letting them know, hey, there's only a limited time. Maybe that goes back to the fact that as he's busy, as he's fleeing for his life, in other words, leaving the temple grounds to get away from that stoning, he's going to stop and do this thing. It's one of the works that that God sent him to do. And it's daytime. While he's here, he's the light of the world. He's not here anymore. So what does that mean? That there's no light at all? No, we're kind of shining forth those lights. We're bastions of that light. Paul kind of uses the same light and day metaphor, but flips it around. And look at this in Romans 13. He says, and do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent. So that's what Paul's looking at as the now. He's writing in this day, which is our same day. He refers to it as the night. The night is far spent. The day is at hand. So in other words, the coming of the Lord, the salvation that we're promised, that's near. That's the day that's coming. And so he kind of flips that metaphor around, whereas Jesus says, I got to work while it's day. He's currently there on the earth. He's the light of the world. It's day while he's there, and when he leaves, this is about life and death, right? Paul's talking about all the wickedness in the world around us and the salvation that's going to come. And because of all that, let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. All the things that God can empower us with and give us to do the works that he's given us to do, that's what we need to be putting on. Let us walk properly then, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. That's where we can look at as Jesus and look at the fact that he's not so distracted and leaving that scene to not notice this. He's not making provision for his flesh, and that's a hard thing to do, to make no provision for the flesh. This doesn't mean not to eat, not to drink, and not to do these other things. The idea is don't make provision at all. Don't make any foresight plans. The only other time I think you see this word is in Acts, and the guy's trying to butter up the leader, and he's saying, oh, and your great foresight and your great provision, you've made these things happen, right? Because you've planned ahead. In other words, don't plan ahead for the things that are sinful. Like if we make plans in our head to say, okay, maybe I have an opportunity for this, or maybe I have an opportunity for that, or I'm going to maneuver my way and on this chessboard of life to say, okay, I'm going to actually get away with something. Make no provision for that whatsoever to fulfill that lust. And you look to Jesus for that. He didn't make any provision for the flesh. The food for him was to do the will of his Father. So limited time to accomplish his work, and we have a limited time as well. And you think about all the stuff going on around in the world today, it's easy to lose sight of the end game. It's easy to lose sight of the day that's at hand when we have like the fog of this world encroaching. We just started reading through this book at home, kind of for a family devotion called Heaven by Randy Alcorn. And in the beginning of that book, he tells this really awesome story. And I didn't know that she was from San Diego. She was born in San Diego, she died in San Diego, and now she's in the Swimmers Hall of Fame. But a woman by the name of Florence Chadwick, she was the first woman to swim back and forth across the English Channel. And he opens that book by telling the story of how she was going to swim from the shore to Catalina Island. And so 15 hours into this swim, she's swimming almost there. She doesn't know that she's almost there, and the fog kind of sets in. She loses sight of the island. And she's got all these boats around her to make sure that she's safe, that there's no sharks and all these other things. And her mother, who knows that it's right there, is kind of coaching her, saying, hey, the shore's right there. We can keep going. It's not far. And she just tried as hard as she could, and she couldn't make it. They pull her into the boat. And then the fog kind of clears out, and she sees the island. And she's just like, later on she recounts, if I had known how close I was, if I had seen the island, I would have made it. I would have made it. And that's kind of how the life is. If we realize how close the day was at hand, and nobody knows when we're gonna die. Nobody knows when we're not guaranteed it. We're always told to watch. We're always told to be aware when the Lord could return. Look, because your redemption is drawing nigh. But we don't know individually when any of us are going to be gone. But if we keep that day that's at hand, that salvation that's nearer than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it is, it's a lot easier to work and to do the things that God's called us to do. She would later on go and make that swim multiple times. The next time she did that swim, she'll recall in her biography, the same thing happened. The fog set in, but she said, kept in her mind's eye the shoreline. And that's what we need to do, the same thing. Keep that in our mind's eye, that the salvation is near. Jesus has done these things. Keep it in your foresight there. Insight number 4. Jesus was willing and able to heal this man, but it required humility and obedience. I think a lot of the discussion around this and all the commentaries, everything's going along really nice in the commentaries, and then you hit these verses, and it's just like, boom, 100 different opinions. Why did Jesus heal the man this way? I don't know, right? Nobody really knows. He could have just touched him. He could have said the words. He could have done it remotely, like we saw earlier, when he's earlier in John, where he heals the nobleman's son. So why the spit? Why the clay? Don't really know. There's some decent guesses. A lot of the commentators relate this back to Genesis, right? He forms man out of the dust of the ground, and you see these things, and Jesus has power over creation and all that stuff. That's been well kind of solidified already in John. We don't really know why he uses these material means. But when I read this, I'll just tell you where my mind went, and I think of Revelation chapter 3. Pastor did a good job on this Laodicean church a few weeks, maybe it was months ago now. But he says in chapter 3, because you say I'm rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and do not know that you're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich. Thinking of spiritual things. You may have white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes. Jesus anointed this man's eyes, and in Revelation 3, he's saying, anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. This blind man knew he couldn't see. He never had seen. And then now he couldn't see, but I think he definitely heard, right? It's kind of a weird thing to think about. Enough spittle to make the clay, and he's probably thinking like, what is this guy doing? Because he probably heard something, right? It's not really the nicest thing to think about, but spits on the ground. Maybe his even disciples are looking on, what in the world is Jesus doing? Is he doing this spittle thing again? And the blind man's saying, I'd love to be healed, but what's that noise? Like, what are you putting on my eyes? But it was pretty common for people to put eye salves on things back then. But this wasn't just any eye salve. This was Jesus putting the saliva and clay mixture together onto his eyes. But it's the direction, I think, that's maybe more important. Maybe there's some connection that I'm missing in Scripture, but I think for here, he could have just said, you can see. He could have just said, go your way, and then at some point, you're going to be able to see. But no, he tells him, okay, go down to Siloam, which is sent. That's where they drew the waters to do that whole Feast of Tabernacle celebration with every day. They draw the waters from this pool. So now he's making his way through the city with this stuff on his eyes. He doesn't care how he looks, right? He doesn't care what people are saying or even thinking about him because he's blind. He doesn't care. This is a humbling experience, but he's already there. He's already at the end, right? He's not like these Pharisees who are saying, oh, I can see just fine. I don't need what you're offering. And then that obedience, go. They say it 3 times in here, and he recounts the story. Go and wash. Go and wash. Go and wash. When he recounts the story. So there's a little bit of humility required, and there's obedience required, and that's really what we see in this section here. He has what the Pharisees don't have, a willingness to believe. He already knows what he doesn't have. He can't see physically, but this is all for a spiritual metaphor, right? He physically can't see. The Pharisees can see just fine through their physical eyes, but spiritually, they're dark. This man physically couldn't see, but he's willing to say, okay, I'm going to do what you're saying to do because I want to see, and I believe that you can do something about it. And that's kind of the way it is in terms of our salvation. We don't really know how things are going to turn out, but it requires that humility to listen to what Jesus says and then the obedience to actually go and do it. So we see that kind of play out there. Moving on, so insight 5, drastic changes often invite observation, suspicion, and inquiry. So if we're looking at this from the idea of a salvation experience for this man, excuse me, he goes back to his old neighborhood. His neighbors notice him in verse 8. His neighbors and those who previously had, and previously had seen that he was blind, said, is this not he who sat and begged? And then you get this whole kind of, is this really who it is? Were you actually healed? And they're asking him all these questions. So he says, how are your eyes open? And then this is where he says, okay, a man named Jesus makes clay. He anointed my eyes. And he said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And so I went and I washed and I received my sight. And that's kind of his refrain. I went and I washed and I received my sight. And that's what he says to the Pharisees. I went and I washed and I received my sight. And that's all I know. I was blind, but now I see. And I did those things. And then they're probably asking, where is he, right? Where is this guy? Like, I have something I need to get fixed too, right? And isn't that what happens? These changes in your life, you come to Jesus or you hear about Jesus, and it changes things, but it invites that observation, people saying, is this the same person? Like, really, what's changed? Like, what's the angle here? Or, you just get people wanting to know about him, and that's a great thing. Here's something from Matthew Henry. He says, those whose eyes are opened and whose hearts are cleansed by grace, being known to be the same person, but widely different in character, live as monuments to the Redeemer's glory and recommend his grace to all who desire the same precious salvation. So massive change. You can't get any more drastic than blind from birth to I can see now. And he's probably getting bombarded not just by these people, but all the input, the stimuli that he'd never had before, right? Shapes and colors and all these amazing things. And that's the difference between being in darkness and sin and being in the marvelous light and being redeemed. It's that drastic. Insight 6, Jesus' work, though evident, is criticized. So what we see now is these 3 rounds of interrogation. They take him to the Pharisees, he gets interrogated. Pharisees aren't happy with that, so they bring his parents in, and then they bring him back. So in these 3 rounds of interrogation, we see different things. Jesus' work, it's evident, but it's highly criticized, particularly because it was another Sabbath healing. We already saw problems with that earlier in John, where he heals someone on the Sabbath, the man at the pool of Bethesda, and it's their biggest issue is, how could you heal this man? It's the Sabbath. It kind of shows you their nature. Like, they don't really care about people. They've turned the Sabbath, which was made for man, into a burden instead of the blessing that it was intended to be. So they bring him in, and they want to know, how did this happen? The Pharisees ask him how he received his sight, and what does he say? Put clay on my eyes, I washed, and I see. He's a little bit more curt with the Pharisees. It's not like he was with his neighbors. And then their response is to say, this man's not from God. Why? Because he does not keep the Sabbath. But then you have kind of the common sense people weigh in saying, well, how can a man who's a sinner do these things? And so that creates a division. If he's actually a sinner, if he's sent from God, well then, how can he do these things, right? He must be from God. And so, in kind of an ironic twist, they say to the blind man, well, can you weigh in here? Can you give us your input? They're asking somebody who's completely unschooled, who had lived his whole life nearby the temple, maybe overhearing some things. And we're going to find out later he overheard a lot of things. He actually knew quite a bit. Well, what do you say about this man since he opened your eyes? And all he can say is, and rightly so, is he's a prophet. He must be sent from God, because who else is going to heal me in this way? That's his only deduction, and that's the right deduction, right? This man heals me, his name's Jesus, don't know anything else about him, but he healed my eyes, he must be from God. Here's what we say in Luke. Another healing in Luke chapter 13. He's teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years and was bent over and could in no way raise herself up. So another situation, again, hard to understand that this woman of 18 years has this situation here. But Jesus sees her, calls to her, and said to her, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he said to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore, come and be healed on them, and not on the Sabbath." That's just cold and callous. Like, who's going to be so upset about that? There's 6 days. You can do this on any day that you want. But you know what he said? What he couldn't deny? That a healing was done, that a miracle was done. And these Pharisees in John 9 are in the same situation. They can't deny the miracle, but they can still criticize Jesus. Moving on to 15, the Lord answered him and said, "Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham," kind of calling him out, saying, this is one of your people, "whom Satan has bound. Think of it, for 18 years be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath." And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. That's the proper response. Glorify God. Rejoice. Insight number 7, I got to kind of pick up the pace a little bit here. Jesus' work, though effective, brings division. Jesus' work, though effective, brings division. And we see what happens here with the parents, and you can think to yourself, these must be some of the worst parents ever recorded in history, right? They should be taking care of their son, first of all, and they're not. He's begging. He's clearly not living at home because his neighbors are the rest of the infirm. And when they call the parents in, they're already preoccupied, and John gives us that editorial insight here saying that they said what they said, "He's of age, asked him," because they don't want to get de-synagogued. They don't want to get kicked out. And really that was kind of in a way, a light death sentence, if you can have such a thing as a light death sentence, because now you're out of the community. Maybe you don't do business with these people. Where do you do your commerce at? This is essentially saying you're shunned. It's kind of like the Amish shunning. You can't do business with anyone now. If you're not in the synagogue, you're out of the culture, essentially. And they were avoiding that. And so rather rejoicing that the son is healed, who was blind from birth, sure, they acknowledge it. Yes, it's our son. Yes, he's healed. That's amazing. But boy, we don't know who did it. They definitely knew who did it, right? They definitely knew who healed him, but we want nothing to do with it. He's of age. Ask him. Take care of him. We don't want to be kicked out. And that's sad. That's really sad, but it brings division. Jesus' work, though it's effective, it brings division. We see this in Matthew 10. Don't think that I came to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be those of his own household. And he who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross, things like being desynagogued, being kicked out, being ostracized, being shunned, things like that, if you don't take up those things and follow after me, you're not even worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Prior to saying this, so all this is saying, the context for this is that Jesus is sending out the 12 to do these things, and they're worried, so he's giving them kind of a speech here to give them some confidence. This is what he says before he says that. Don't fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? The very hairs of your head are numbered. So don't fear, therefore, you are of far more value than many sparrows. Therefore, he says in verse 32, for these reasons, whoever confesses me before men, him I also will confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. And this isn't like those Facebook posts that you see where it's just like, you better forward this or you're denying God. It's not the same thing. These parents knew what was in it for them. John already tells us, and as was the case, the Pharisees had already come together and said, listen, if anybody is saying Jesus is the Messiah, they're out. And people knew this. It was an open secret. And these parents weren't willing to celebrate with their son over new vision. They were thinking about themselves, and that brings division. So insight 8, Jesus' work, though eminent, though powerful, though obvious, that nobody beats that, it's preeminent, it prompts rejection. And that's what we see this man. They ultimately cast him out in verse 34, and they contradict what Jesus says. He says, though you were completely born in sin, the Pharisees say, and you're teaching us, and they cast him out. Jesus said it wasn't this man or his sin that caused it. They're going against the truth that Jesus had said. But here's where we get the idea that this man was very astute. His eyes didn't work, but his ears worked just fine. Right? He had already kind of said, hey, he's a prophet, that's my deduction. But he also knows that there was never a recorded healing of blindness in the Old Testament. This never happened. So he answers and says, I told you already, and I love this guy with the sass, right? Do you want to be his disciples? Love that. We were kind of kindred spirits in that way. They revile him and said, you're his disciple, but where Moses is, we know God spoke to Moses, but this fellow, we don't even know where he's from. Except Jesus had told them repeatedly where he's from. You just go read the preceding 8 chapters over and over. So the man answers and says this, and he kind of schools them here. This is a marvelous thing. It's a remarkable thing that you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. We, gentlemen, we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. I mean, that's a mic drop moment right there, right? And they just kick him out after that, because what can they say against that? There's nothing they can say. Luke 4, Jesus goes to the synagogue and he reads this from Isaiah. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind and those who are oppressed. We see in Luke 7, and this is after John inquires, he's having a little bit of doubt about what's going on, and the first thing that Jesus says to John's disciples to go back and tell him and comfort him with is saying, hey, go look around at the things you've seen and heard, and the first thing he says is the blind see. And he lists off all these other miracles, but I think that first one would have been the only one that he needed. The blind see, John. Blessed is he who's not offended because of me. And then we see all these from the Old Testament. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. In Isaiah, the eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness. Chapter 35, the eyes of the blind shall be opened. Chapter 42, to open the eyes of the blind, that's what the Messiah is to come to do. And to look, you blind, that you may see. So we see that there. And then finally, insight number 9, Jesus alone has the remedy for spiritual blindness. Jesus hears that they cast him out, and still full of compassion, he says, He finds him. He seeks him out. That's what God does. He takes the initiative here. God's always the initiator here. In salvation, God's always the initiator. We're responders to it, but he initiates it. And even today, Jesus isn't here, right? He's not the light of the world anymore, but his Spirit's here. We shine forth as lights. We're able to give his word. That's working. That's the initiator right there. We give the word, the gospel to people. That's the power of God to salvation. Don't forget it. So Jesus goes and says to him, do you believe in the Son of God? And he wants to know. This guy's primed and ready to believe. And he says, Lord, who is he? And this is Lord, as in Sir, that I may believe him. And Jesus says, you've both seen him, and it's he who's talking with you. And then now he says, Lord, this is God. You're the Son of God. I believe. And he properly worships him. Notice Jesus doesn't stop him. And if we notice that in the text, people certainly notice that in real life. Hey, this blind guy is worshiping Jesus. And Jesus doesn't stop him. So Jesus says to him, for judgment I've come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be blind. And then some of the Pharisees who were with him, probably tagging along, said to him, hey, are we blind also? Are we blind also, Jesus? Is that a dig at us? Yeah, it's a dig at you. Then some of the Pharisees were with him say this, and Jesus says, if you were blind, you would have no sin. If you were like this guy who was blind from birth, and he gets resolution to this problem, in humility and in obedience, he does what he said, and he listened to me. If you had spiritual ears, if you had spiritual eyes, you would be fine, but you don't. But you say, we see, so your sin remains. And Jesus didn't come in for judgment, right? The condemnation's already there. We see that in John 3:19. Judgment's inevitable result of his coming for those who have rejected him, those who have refused to believe. But in Proverbs 26, we see, do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. That kind of sums up chapter 9 very nicely. Spurgeon says this, it's not our littleness that hinders Christ, but our bigness. It's not our weakness that hinders Christ, it's our strength. It's not our darkness that hinders Christ, it is our supposed light that holds back his hand. It's this idea of, yeah, I'm good. I'm too big, I'm too strong, I've got enough to see, right? But we're kind of like the guy who Jesus heals elsewhere, where he heals him a little bit and he says, well, I can see, but these guys, the humans are like trees, right? They kind of have the figure of a human, but not really. And that's us when we see like, oh, I can do something under my own strength or my own mental fortitude or my own wisdom. Nope, fools got more hope than you do. So it's Jesus that brings spiritual insight, who cleanses those blind eyes. And I think we can all be so thankful for that. And help us not be too big and too strong and too wise in our own sight on our own. We need to lean on Christ, because as we shine forth that light, that's the power of God, again, to salvation. It's spreading forth that same message. That's what's going to help open people's eyes. And with all that comes criticism, and with all that comes rejection, and with all that comes division. But are you willing to lay that aside, to bear that cross, to walk worthy, and to do the work that you've been called to do in the same way that Jesus did it, not making those provisions for the flesh? So there's John 9, and it was rushed, but wanted to get all that chapter done at once because I think it was fitting. Any questions, comments, concerns, insights? Yes, Anna?
You would think that there was a lot of water, but you can't do much with just a little bit of spit. So it had to be a very small amount. They say clay, well that's, I guess, better than saying mud. But I'm thinking there wasn't very much put on his eyes from the little bit of spit or the dirt that they had. So I'm thinking Jesus did a whole lot with just a little.
Yep.
Anybody, I would think, listen, that's not a whole lot of stuff to work with, but yet the man he's seeing. He was blind, and Jackie said, how did he get to the water? Get to the somebody had to lead him, and he probably had somebody that took care of him because he wasn't living with his parents. So somebody had to be helping him do what he was doing, getting him groceries, food, or whatever he needed. So somebody was helping him along.
Yeah. Very good. All right, anything else here? Wonderful. Pastor Joel, would you mind closing today in prayer?
Dear God, thank you for the sight that you give. Lord, help us to recognize our blindness. Thank you for we can come to you and as your disciples